Welcome to episode 10 of the Informing Choices mini-pod, our first podcast of 2021. Agriculture is responsible for about 9% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, according to Farm Carbon Toolkit. These emissions are the result of livestock rearing, natural processes, crop fertilisation using chemical fertilisers, materials used to build and maintain farms, energy use of farm buildings and vehicles, transport and distribution during and after growing, and soil-based emissions from disturbing soils, as well as waste produced from the result of the farming process. So how might the urbanisation of agriculture change this landscape in the future? To talk about these issues within the broad theme of the future of sustainable urban agriculture, I'm delighted to welcome Diana Davidson, who helps enterprises develop performance for zero carbon emissions strategy. Diana, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about your focus and your business, what you do.
Hi, Steve. Well, welcome, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. My background is in agriculture initially, but unlike most agriculturalists, I actually went into genetics, but that's a slightly different story. But what I was particularly interested in most recently, I was appointed by the Agriculture Horticulture Development Board to write a scoping study, which was on urban horticulture, which is an area which, interestingly enough, they were struggling with. And where we were particularly looking at how we might develop strategies and policies which were clearly needed in the new agriculture bill, which was recently launched, the first for almost 50 years.
Wow.
And clearly there's been a lot of changes within our industry in the last 50 years. And so we needed to bridge that gap in meaningful ways, because clearly our world has changed dramatically in the last 12 months or so, particularly when we're looking at COVID. Clearly, when we were looking at the agriculture bill then, we knew nothing about COVID. But interesting enough, the points that came up really resonate even more now as to how and where we actually produce our food. Because also with Brexit, you'll know that quite a lot of our food is currently imported from abroad, and the majority of it is more than 50%. And clearly we need to start to look at that to see how we can make our country more resilient and self-sufficient in the resources it needs as our population continues to grow. And then, of course, we're starting to look at, yes, creating policies in areas which perhaps we've never even thought about before, starting to look at growing food in places which we've never thought of before, because clearly our cities are growing substantially. And when we start to look at our carbon profiles, we start to realize that, yes, just growing the crops that we eat is actually just part of the puzzle which we're struggling with. And it's also about the infrastructure and moving that food around, how we actually promote it in terms of producing new products and things that we might want to eat, but also distributing it, and also looking at how we store it and save it and use it for our families and nutrition. All these things, all these aspects generate and create carbon. And increasingly that carbon is focused within urban areas where most of us live.
Yep.
And certainly within the UK, we have a predominantly urban population, more so than many countries. And so, if you like, we're facing that problem and that challenge more severely than other countries. And so we need to start looking at these solutions more closely. And so that's what we've been doing, looking at how we might grow food nearer to where the people are and where they want to eat the food. And that made us start to look at what we call controlled environment agriculture.
Yep.
Agriculture, in essence, which is growing food predominantly in cities, but actually in environments which are usually built and highly controlled. So not in the fields, not in rural areas as before, but actually quite often in repurposed buildings, and in buildings which perhaps had a different life in an environment which has never grown food before.
Yeah.
So looking at that has created a lot more different parameters of challenge. First of all, the most important thing is to get the policies in place, because that creates a trigger for for all the other aspects of the PESTLE model, which we've all learned when we were studying for our MBAs, but also looking at things like funding, which is really important to get right from the very beginning, and the ability to look at how that will help us to drive change in positive ways. So then looking around at, how we might look at investing in these areas is itself a challenge, because quite often we're looking at growing foods in ways that haven't been done before, haven't been tried before, and haven't been proven and tested before. So as you can imagine, it's not exactly the most compelling investment proposition. So we need to get around that in ways which, engage the funding and the investment communities in really positive ways. And so, we need to work on that as well. And then going around to the actual social aspect of it, how would you feel if your food was grown in a building somewhere in what you might see as laboratory-like conditions? Trying to get people on board with that in positive ways is itself a challenge, but also an opportunity.
That's already happening, though, isn't it? I mean, if you pick up a cucumber in Sainsbury's or Marks and Spencer's, then there's a 1 in 10 chance that it's been grown in planet Earth, which is exactly that kind of environment. So that's already happening, isn't it?
Exactly, but that's in a greenhouse environment, which most people are kind of comfortable with because maybe they've got a greenhouse in their garden.
Yeah, okay.
But when you start looking at things which are maybe grown under UV lights, and where you might even, as one of our underground farms is 33 meters below the streets of London in a bomb shelter from World War II, you sit there thinking, wow, this is really different. Is this really where I want my food to be grown? And interestingly enough, the younger people are really up for this.
Yeah.
They see the point, they've joined the dots, and they really understand the science that's behind it. And I think they're really sort of engaged with that, and that's fantastic to see. But then they're also looking at the health aspects of it. And clearly with COVID, that's something really important, because we're suddenly realizing that what we're eating is really important to keep us healthy and resilient to these nasty diseases and bugs. So in order to look at health, it's really important, but also the cultural aspects of it, because some societies are very diverse nowadays, especially in cities. So some cultures, want different things. They have different tastes, viewpoints on things. So something as simple as maybe growing something on a woolen carpet, which is quite interesting. There's one producer who produces it on carpet off tiles, which happen to be woolen. You start looking at that, and some people see that as being poor. They don't like that because they're vegans and they don't believe in the production of wool. So these things start to become more complex, because we have to engage everyone and make sure everyone's bought into these things. And then we start to look, yes, most importantly, at the environmental aspect of it. And if we can grow our food locally, if we can grow it where we're actually wanting to buy it, it's fresher, it's not come from far away. We're able to see exactly how it's produced. We can see the transparency of that system. And we can also look at, perhaps knowing some of the people who grow it, think, well, actually, this is creating jobs, in my backyard.
Yeah.
And we can also look at, the fact that when it's actually produced, the carbon impact is very much lighter than if it's perhaps produced far away, using resources that are more finite than they might be, close to home. And so that's really interesting. And looking at how we might look at developing that so that our communities in our cities are more resilient to change, to climate change, and to the climate change which undoubtedly is coming, no matter what we do, it seems, and start to look at, how we can, create supply chains that are able to be more resilient to this and to be more stable. So these are all exciting things which can be looked at.
There's two things you've started to touch on that I'd just like to drill down a little bit more on. One is, what do you see as the specific enabling technologies for urban agriculture? Because I think there are a number of things that I think of, but then, kind of, what do I know? So what are the really important enabling technologies, do you think?
Well, technologies behind most of them, but the two technologies particularly that are prevalent are hydroponics or aquaponics. Hydroponics really has become the mainstay.
Yeah.
And that's where we're actually growing the crops in a water solution, either where we're immersing the roots in actual water-based solutions themselves, or whether we're actually spraying the roots with a sort of a water spray in order to provide them with yes, moisture, but also nutrients.
Yep.
And that's the main way of producing these crops, especially when you're looking at vertical farming solutions, which are the mainstay really of where we're looking at with urban food. And we're starting to look at, yes, at greenhouses on roofs and all sorts of other systems, but the majority in terms of volume and year-round food production within low carbon or carbon zero emissions regulations, it is really looking at things like vertical farming and controlled environment agricultural systems, and the majority of those are based on hydroponics.
And presumably artificial intelligence and robotics starts to play a role in some of the kind of the management and the monitoring of those systems as well.
Yes, those systems are increasingly becoming automated. They're increasingly featuring robotics. And interestingly enough, the UK is brilliant at doing these types of innovation, particularly at the University of Lincoln. They're majoring on robotics, especially within the horticultural industry. Yeah. And these robotics are super smart, so it enables us to minimize, yes, the amount of human interaction, but also it helps us to keep these environments super clean and hygienic, which is really important because a lot of the crops which are produced are, you don't need to wash them or clean or rinse them after you bought them under the tap, because they already are clean and able to be consumed right from the packet or from the punnet. So yes, reducing the costs, because clearly costs are important. And we're looking at a finite product that has to be harvested year round and sometimes 24/7, although plants do sleep, interestingly enough. They need 8 hours like we do. But they also minimize the amount of human touch and interaction, which potentially could be a source of infections or transfer of pathogens, which is also something which people are mindful of nowadays.
So the other thing you've touched on a couple of times as well is how you might integrate some of these technologies and this kind of urbanization of agriculture into the city. So how does the notion, and I know there are lots of ideas around smart cities, but how does urbanized agriculture integrate with a smart city concept?
Well, most cities are already built, so we have to predominantly start to look at, inserting them into city environments which already exist. Yeah. Although some new cities start with a vertical farm and then build a community around it. Well, that's a slightly different approach. But in London, what we've been doing is, interesting enough, our urban environment has already been mapped in something which is called a digital twin. Digital twins are basically digital reproductions of the entire city landscape and all the buildings and infrastructure within it. So it enables us to look at exactly where perhaps we might locate a vertical farm and the communities that we're trying to serve. And it gives us an ability to understand the sort of market forces that might be prevalent within that area, which post-COVID is increasingly important because that has dramatically changed. It also enables us to look at how we might integrate with retail giants, retail hubs, because certainly one of the major London vertical farms that I know of is increasingly starting to interact with nationwide producers of salads and retailers who cover the whole of the country. So it enables us to grow the salads in London, but then distribute out to all of the United Kingdom so that they can have access to freshly produced salads.
Wow, that's really interesting. So the last question I've got at the moment might be, probably deserves a podcast all of its own. But one of the things that I'm thinking is, how might the urbanization of agriculture impact rural life and change the way that we manage land in a rural setting in the future?
Well, interestingly enough, with climate change, clearly there's a lot of interest in this area because we're going to be seeing a very dynamic temperature change as we start to edge towards at least 1.5, perhaps even 2 degrees hotter. And that will have an impact on the actual changes of the temperatures which we're growing in as well as starting to look at, wetter climates and freak events in terms of weather. So that then it creates a very challenging position for growers and farmers in the rural environment. And looking at how we might get around that is starting to look at different ways of using land. And that's something which is really important, and how we're looking at bridging perhaps the gap between urban and rural in a positive way. So starting to look at things like perhaps how we might regenerate food waste from the urban environment, and start to look at generating things like biodiesel and biogas increasingly. And this biogas enables us to start looking at creating energy from some of the food waste. And part of this process is creating something called digestate, which is what's left behind after the anaerobic process. And this is then used to create organic fertilizers, which you can then put back onto the land. Thereby, instead of leaving it to be emitted into the atmosphere, you're then able to start to capture it and put it back into the soil where it can be contained. And that's a far more holistic and a circular way of looking at how we can build a link between urban and rural and reuse food waste in a positive way, which doesn't generate the gas that you mentioned at the very beginning of our talk.
Well, that's fascinating. I love that as a way to kind of end the podcast. That kind of circular piece that you brought together beautifully there, I think was really compelling. Diana, that's been absolutely wonderful. How can people get hold of you if they want to know more about you and what you do?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm sure most of our listeners are as well. So please have a look and find me there. My email is diana@vertemis, which is vertemis.com. And also, I'm on most of the social media feeds. So feel free and get in touch. I'd love to hear from you and receive your comments.
Well, Diana, thank you so much indeed for your time today. That's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you everyone for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast.